Okay, so right, we are, believe it or not, almost done with the nematoda and arthropods to cover, and then my God, it's all going to be over, and I don't know what I'm going to do. Um, anyway, right. So we've talked about Anoplea nematodes. That includes whipworm and trichina. Chromadoria includes a lot of non-parasitic species, but there's parasitic tylenchids, and we talked about those. Those include a lot of insect parasites, including that one that's used as biological control, controlling wood wasps in Australia and New Zealand, and that weird one that's a parasite of both a plant and an animal at different stages in its life cycle. Rhabditina include hookworm and includes a lot of parasites of veterinary importance. And then the last major group is the Spirurina. Who's in the Spirurina? Well, Ascaridomorpha is, I guess, a suborder, I think, of nematodes that tend to be the large intestinal parasites. Ascarididae is intestinal parasites of mammals, including humans, including the next slide, which is going to be a little yucky. Anasacidae, which you've all seen now, they're stomach parasites of marine fish, birds, and mammals, including Anisakis, where the adults are parasitic in fish-eating whales, fish-eating marine mammals, and occasionally fish-eating people. And then the Ascaridiidae, it's only one letter off of the Ascarididae, which is some parasites of birds that I don't think we have time to get into. The second major group, Oxyuridomorpha, includes the nematodes that some of you, well, I hope all of you got at least a glance at them, but some of you got a lot of them back when we did the cockroach dissection lab. That includes the Thelostoma or Thelassoma, probably, nematodes and the cockroaches. They include various others, including human pinworm. Spiruromorpha includes filarial worms, like the ones that cause canine heartworm. You all have seen those by now in lab. We have those slides of the blood of an infected dog with the filarial stage inside. That also includes worms that cause severe human disease, notably one called elephantiasis. We'll get to that on Monday. And then Gnathostomatomorpha includes the guinea worms, genus Dracunculus, one of which is truly horrifying, but also has been one of the great success stories of public health in recent years. And by the gods, I think we could all use a positive success story in the public health sector. Right. So let's look at those Ascaridomorph nematodes first. First slide's kind of yucky. That's a bit of human intestine removed from someone with a heavy infestation of Ascaris lumbricoides, the human intestinal roundworm. Very common parasite, infecting between 800 million and 1.25 billion people worldwide. As of the last data I've got is from the 70s, but as of back then, something like 20,000 people died each year from Ascaris lumbricoides, often by intestinal blockage. If your intestine gets blocked with a knot of Ascaris lumbricoides, that's an immediate surgical emergency. Without access to immediate surgical care, you'll die. And it happens to, older stats were something like 20,000 people every year. Ew. The life cycle is basically your fecal oral route. Eggs pass in feces, eggs develop outside the body. Infection is transmitted by swallowing eggs, often in contaminated food. This is yet another reason why fresh human sewage should not be used on your fields. There are ways you can use human feces safely as fertilizer that involve composting it. The heat from that process will kill these off, but untreated human waste should never be used to grow food. If anybody really needs to know how to do this, there's a book out called the Humanure Handbook that talks about how to compost human waste safely. Not that many of you particularly want to know that, but it's out there. I think it's free on the web. Anyway, you could get these by, if the egg end up in soil or end up in dust or something like that, you could get these transported some distance, and you swallow the eggs. The eggs hatch into larvae. The larvae do that migrating thing. They'll burrow out of your intestines, pass into the bloodstream, end up in other organs, eventually the lungs, and from the lungs they're coughed up and swallowed back down. You might remember hookworm does something similar. Once they're back in the intestine, that's when they do their final molt. They mature sexually and they reproduce. The cuticle of these guys has a lot of odd compounds in it. They secrete enzyme inhibitors, keeping themselves from being digested. Sorry, I should have warned you about this. The adults mostly feed on digested food. Unlike hookworms, they're not directly taking blood. But naturally, if you have a high rate of infection with Ascaris, means that you're not getting the full benefit of the food you eat. So you may be losing weight, even eating normally. You can end up with malabsorption syndrome, which is basically anything that results when your intestine is not absorbing food the way it should. Typically that's bloating, cramping, nausea, weight loss, diarrhea, things like that. And then wandering adult worms have been known to poke holes in the intestine. They've been known to cause abscesses. As you saw, they've been known to form these knots that will block the intestine or sometimes end up in the appendix and impact it, causing appendicitis. They can even migrate into the stomach and end up getting vomited out or sneezed out, or simply crawling out. Yeah, sorry about that. Next slide's a little bit easier. These are some more of those roundworm eggs that turned up in archaeological deposits, and these happen to come from the Middle Ages, from the town of Namur in Belgium, dating to about the year 1300. Up at the top, that's Trichuris, the whipworm, and you ought to recognize those right away. That football shape and those clear caps on the ends are pretty unmistakable. And we mentioned that these have been found in, Viking latrines and Greek and Roman remains all the way back at least to the dawn of agriculture at Çatalhöyük in Turkey. Trichuris goes back that far. I'm not sure how far Ascaris goes back, but it's probably very close to going back that far. And the Ascaris eggs are on the bottom. That kind of bumpy shape to them is pretty distinctive. And it's worth noting that this particular poop from medieval Belgium was so well preserved that it was actually possible to extract the remains of bacteriophage viruses from it and get pictures of them under the electron microscope. One of the very few cases I can think of where we've been able to document fossil viruses. kind of the ultimate in micropaleontology there, I suppose. So humans have been associated with Ascaris for quite a long time. I'm guessing it would have started becoming prevalent in human populations at about the same time that agriculture does, which is probably about the same time that Trichuris did. And for the same reason, people noticed that manure makes plants grow. So they would have started spreading it on their fields, and that might have been good for the crops, but it also opens new possibilities for fecally transmitted parasites to infect everybody. Worth noting that Ascaris is native to both hemispheres. The native people of Central America suffered from Ascaris, and they had a treatment. They ate the leaves and drank tea from Chenopodium ambrozoides. Chenopodium is, the family is sometimes called the goosefoot family. Chenopodium, I believe, includes quinoa, this seed you can get as a grain substitute that's popular in whole paycheck and things like that. One thing I haven't seen in this country so much, although I might not be shopping at the right stores, is that in some parts of Mexico, in particular South Mexico, I think, kind of the Yucatan Peninsula, this is used in cooking to flavor food. It's got this medicinal flavor, and it's called epazote. And I don't think we tend to get it in the Tex-Mex cuisine that we usually get on this side of the Rio Grande. But if you ever go down to South Mexico and get the real, authentic cooking, you may get to taste some epazote. And it can be used just as a flavoring, but it began as a remedy for Ascaris infection. There is an essential oil in the leaves and in tea made from it that parasites really don't like. Oh, sorry, I should have warned you again. That's pig intestine this time. Ascaris lumbricoides is virtually indistinguishable from a pig roundworm, Ascaris suum. They do seem to be separate species. They don't seem to have any gene flow between them. It's a reasonable hypothesis that Ascaris lumbricoides might have evolved from pig roundworms right about the time that humans were domesticating pigs and keeping them in close proximity and eating them. I'm not sure, though. That would be an interesting thing to look at. Humans can get infected by Ascaris suum if they come into a lot of contact with pig feces. There are, this is the kind of thing that pig farmers can get. There have been some outbreaks of it in areas that raise a lot of pigs. There's actually labs I thought about doing that would have involved getting some pig intestines from the nearest slaughterhouse and looking at Ascaris suum. The problem is that the body fluids of Ascaris tend to be extremely allergenic. They can induce people to go into anaphylactic shock pretty quickly. It can actually be dangerous if you inhale droplets. So that's one reason why I've never had students dissect these guys. And also, ew. But they were apparently so common in domestic pigs that just about any slaughterhouse that processes pigs gets a ready supply of Ascaris suum. The next picture is also a little yucky. There's a very closely related worm that infects horses. Well, it says equines, so this would include donkeys and zebras as well. Noted for being very hard to treat. You need big doses of medicine for it. This is Parascaris equorum. And also ew. Bayless ascaris I actually talked about earlier on. Most wild raccoons are infected with Bayless ascaris procyanus. There's eggs down below. There's an immature one at the right and one with the juvenile inside it at the left. The larvae can be transmitted directly, or they can enter over 90 species of paratenic hosts. So the larvae can infect mice, and then the mice get eaten by raccoons. And as I've mentioned before, humans can get infected by this if you come into contact with raccoon feces. This is a problem because raccoons like to defecate in the same spot. And I've heard stories about people discovering that a whole family of raccoons has taken up residence in the attic and having to deal with the fact that they've all been pooping in the same place night after night. So you might have several pounds of raccoon poop to get out of your attic. And if this ever happens to you, make sure you're wearing filters and protective gear, because in that situation, if you inhale or ingest any of the eggs by mistake, the larvae can travel, migrate through the body. Remember, we call this larva migrans. And the larvae can end up in all sorts of places you would not want them, notably the brain. So I've thought about bringing in roadkill to this class for you folks to dissect and look for parasites. This is one reason why I haven't. Would not want anybody to come down with Bayless ascaris, visceral larval migrans. So be careful about handling raccoon poop. Never let it be said I don't teach useful things. You vets might encounter these. These are the main ascarid parasites of dogs and cats, Toxocara and Toxoscaris. Toxo, by the way, means an arrow, which, by the way, is also the root of our words toxin and toxic. To swallow something that's a toxin will strike you down like you've been hit with an arrow. That's where the word comes from. And the common name for these is arrowhead worm, because they have these flanges, these just kind of flat extensions of the cuticle sticking out that make the head look a lot like an arrowhead. These can be ingested. The eggs can be eaten directly if your dog eats poop, or they can be transmitted by paratenic hosts like mice if your cat eats mice. Humans that get this can also come down with visceral larval migrans, something you have to watch out for if your kids play in a sandbox and there's lots of cats in the vicinity. Yeah, some good reason to keep your sandbox covered when the kids aren't using it. Right. And that's an electron micrograph of the same thing. You can see those three lips. Remember that having three of everything is typical for nematodes. And those flanges on the head, they're called cephalic alae. Alae happens to be Latin for wings. I mean, these, of course, don't fly, but they reminded somebody of wings who was probably on drugs. Right. And you've probably seen all the anisakis that you care to. Adults parasitize marine mammals. Eggs pass out in the feces. The eggs develop in the water. Larvae get eaten by swimming crustaceans. The crustaceans get eaten by fish and squid. They can pass on up the food chain and eventually get ingested by marine mammals, whales, seals, dolphins, sea lions, what have you. And that's where they develop into adult worms. Humans, of course, become incidental hosts if you eat raw or undercooked seafood. And, as we've seen, you can get these in wild-caught salmon. I have been told that tuna is actually strangely very safe, that you usually don't find these in tuna, but you could get them in squid, you could get them in other fish that are high up on the food chain. A close relative of Anisakis called Pseudoterra nova is called the codworm because it happens to be common in Gadus morhua, the Atlantic codfish. I actually bought some cod one year for students to look at, and we didn't succeed in finding any worms. So your supermarket is probably safe. But every so often, somebody buys some fish and discovers that there's a live worm in it. I mentioned there's a number of videos on YouTube of local interest news stories where somebody buys very fresh fish from Costco or Whole Paycheck and a live worm pops out. If you eat these live, you do suffer symptoms. They cause general gastric distress, vomiting, cramping, bloating, things like that. And I mentioned this in lab, but freezing the fish, especially if you quick freeze it, catch it and immediately blast it with liquid nitrogen and keeping it frozen for a long period of time. I think it's like 24 hours at 31 below Celsius will kill the parasites. So if your fish has been previously frozen, it is not going to have anything infective in it. If your fish hasn't been frozen, it could harbor these worms. Cook it and you'll be fine. People tend to get this when they've eaten fish dishes that either aren't cooked, like sushi, or that are prepared but not cooked to a high enough temperature, like ceviche, which is made of raw fish that's treated with acid, like marinated in lime juice, I think, or cured salmon, like gravlax from Scandinavia. Even smoked can sometimes contain live worms. As long as you cook it, you'll be all right. And like I was telling you folks in lab yesterday, this doesn't really bother me. Life lives on and sometimes in life. This is just the way things are. And, I just wanted to say, what part of wild caught did you not understand? This just happens. This is actually the head of one that we found in lab a couple of years ago. Hopefully everybody has seen these. I know not everybody got to find them in your salmon. Yesterday we had, most people got nothing, but one person found 11 and one person found 10. So dang, there you are. You can see those low bumps on the head. Those are these 3 bumps. There's 3 of them that are arranged at 120-degree angles around the mouth, and you can just see the little boring tooth coming out of the mouth. So they're pretty straightforward to find. Next picture is a little yucky. They can be extremely common. I'm not even sure what fish that is, but that one is very heavily parasitized. And legally, you have to flash freeze your worms if you're going to use them for sushi. And then most of the fish that we eat in this country is cooked. In Japan, though, where the fish tends to be much fresher and not always flash frozen, there's over 1,000 cases of this each year. Mild infection might just feel like, a little stomach bug. I don't know that anybody's ever died from it, but really heavy infections have been misdiagnosed as things like pancreatic cancer. So, yeah, this can be severe if you get a lot of them. Ew. Okay, right. These are, okay, this is Lady Nema. It might actually be Thelassoma. I've never really keyed these out. There's several different genera of nematodes that you can find living in cockroaches, but these are examples of oxyurids. I've said my piece about Ascaridomorphs. These are Oxyuridomorphs. These have actually evolved haplodiploid sex determination, which you might know is also the way that bees and I think wasps and ants do sex determination. Fertilized eggs are diploid and they develop into females. Unfertilized eggs are haploid and they develop into males. Up at the top, that is a big mama commensal oxyurid nematode from a South American roach. I think we took that picture in lab a few years ago. You can actually see a couple of people in this class saw worms that were this size. They're not only large, but you can see this folded up uterus inside, and you can pick out some eggs. Incidentally, oxyurid means sharp tail, and these worms tend to have this very long, narrow, pointy tail extension. It might look a little bit like a sting, although it isn't. I'm not really sure what the functional significance of it is. But you see this in other oxyurids as well, this extremely narrow, pointy, elongated tail. And then Enterobius vermicularis is also in the Oxyurida. This is human pinworm. Very widespread, at least 400 million people infected, probably the most common parasitic animal in the United States. A lot of the parasites that infect other parts of the world have been brought under control here, as we talked about for hookworm, because of improvements in sanitation. But this is one that a lot of kids get. Tends to be common in, toddlers and school-age children. It's something some of you might have had at a young age. I'm not going to ask you to admit it, but it is very common among young children. Fortunately, it's pretty benign. Far as I know, nobody's ever died from it. They're called pinworm because you have that really sharp tail, the same thing that we saw on the previous slide, and the head looks a little large because there's some cuticular swellings on it. You can see them. This is the head. Down at the lower right, you can see those kind of ridgy looking bumps on the head. That's what we're talking about here. You can see the gut very easily. Leading back to, on the left-hand side, there's a muscular bulb that probably, I assume, provides sucking force. So these worms are mostly microbe feeders. Adult worms live in humans. There are very closely related pinworms that live in other primates. I think I talked about this way back in a previous lecture, but it turns out that the pinworm that is most closely related to yours, Enterobius vermicularis, is the species that parasitizes chimps. And this is probably a case where pinworms infected primates very early in their history, and every time primate species split off, the primate pinworm species also split off. So this is actually a case where the evolutionary history of pinworm mirrors the evolutionary history of primates very closely. Unlike, let's say, those tapeworms we talked about, Taenia solium and Taenia saginata, which their closest relatives, the adults, are pinworms of lions. And our distant ancestors probably got those not because we're related to lions, but we got them from eating the same food that lions were eating, competing for the same food back when our distant ancestors were hunter-gatherers in Africa. Anyway, that was a case of host switching, but not here. Our pinworms are most closely related to chimp pinworms. The adults live throughout the intestines. They probably feed on bacteria and epithelial cells. Usually they don't cause any particular symptoms, except in rare cases of extremely heavy infestation. They just sit there, eat their bacteria, probably eat your epithelial cells, but you lose millions of those every day anyway. And you might not even know they were there, except brace yourself for the next picture. Impregnated females full of eggs crawl out of the human anus. That's what that is. Laying eggs as they go, and they'll come out and lay eggs on the perianal folds, those folds of skin that surround the anus itself. Soon after egg laying, they die. The eggs can be glued to the hairs or glued to the skin on the perianal folds. And the problem with this is this causes itching. This causes itchy butt syndrome. And the eggs look like this. Back when I worked in the Berkeley Free Clinic a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, we almost never saw these, but occasionally we would check people for this. And the standard diagnostic trick is to get a piece of transparent tape and stick it on somebody's anus and then pull it off. And if the eggs are present, they will stick to the tape, and then you put the tape down on a microscope slide and look for eggs that look like this. Yeah, very, very simple diagnostic. I mean, they still probably charge you $10,000 for it, but it's easy enough to do. And the problem is that itching around the anus encourages people to scratch, especially kids who have not yet developed enough self-control not to scratch where they itch. So somebody can scratch around the anus, get eggs under their fingernails, and then put their fingers in their mouths. Gross, but, you know, kind of thing little kids do all the time. They can be spread on clothing. Mommy can get these if, you know, she's handling, you know, her kids' laundry. It tends to be common in kids, but adults can certainly get this as well. You can get this from handling the clothes of an infected person. You can even get them in airborne dust. Sometimes, you know, teachers will get this without direct contact with any kids. It's just that some kid is shedding eggs, and they tend to get everywhere because they're very light and very small. And yeah, they could end up in the dust and contaminate, you know, the teacher's food, or maybe even get breathed in. So this spreads very easily. Eggs can even auto-infect. They might hatch on the perianal folds, and the larvae may crawl right back in and auto-infect the same host. You know, as we've seen, auto-infection isn't that common, but pinworm is a case that sometimes does it. Okay, and again, not particularly dangerous. The main symptom is more an annoyance than anything else, but still something to watch out for. If any of you become pediatricians, this is the kind of thing that you might see. This and head lice are probably the two most common parasitic animals in the United States. You know, just leading a middle-class lifestyle does not make you immune against everything. All right, that actually ended a little bit early. I do seem to go faster when I'm presenting like this compared to how I'd be doing it in a formal lecture. But I'm going to go ahead and bless that and call it dinner and stop recording. And